The American Indian Movement. Clyde Bellecourt was born into the Ojibwe tribe in Minnesota. He dropped out of school after the education system would depict Native Americans as savages and killers. After he dropped out of school, he could not get a job, subsequently leading him to prison for burglaries and robberies. He found hope again while in prison and felt proud to be a Native American. Bellecourt and fellow inmates then created the American Indian Movement. The movement took extreme measures on pressuring the government to help fight racism, empower leadership, and sovereignty. Next, the American Indian College Fund. The president, Cheryl Crazy Bull, of the AAICF. She was born into the Sicangu Lakota tribe. She went to South Dakota State University and studied educational leadership. And she also attended the University of South Dakota and studied business management. Cheryl advocates for self-determination, Native voices, philosophies, and Native traditions. The AICF has raised over $237 million for 143,000 Native Americans to go to college.
5 landmark events. The first event or landmark is AIM. AIM was a Native American group that was trying to recover Native American rights and customs that were once taken from them by the government. Second one is the occupation of Wounded Knee. This is a protest that occurred led by an organization that was called AIM, and they were protesting Native American rights, and it's given this name when a Native American wounded his knee during a fight. The third one is the occupation of Alcatraz. This was a protest for land that was stolen from the Native Americans and stolen with the purpose of destroying Native American culture. The fourth one is occupying Mount Rushmore, and this was also a protest for the broken treaty of Fort Laramie, and they demanded that they fix and respect it, but it just ended up in people being arrested for climbing Mount Rushmore. And then the last one is the Longest Walk, and the Longest Walk was where several hundred American Indians and activists and supporters marched for 5 months from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. to protest threats and to tribal lands and water rights.
Heritage Month is a modern holiday that offers Native Americans an opportunity to share parts of their history with others. It also allows them to share their concerns and suggestions with each other. Every November is a time to celebrate rich and diverse cultures, traditions, and histories, and to acknowledge the important contributions of Native people. The Indian New Deal is an act assisted in the undoing of much of the cultural assimilation that Native Americans have been exposed to earlier in U.S. history. Its mission was to enhance, promote, and preserve Native American cultures in the United States. It was not a wholesale success. The Indian New Deal was essential in changing the U.S. government policies toward American Indians. In the Battle of Little Bighorn, Native chiefs Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull led armies of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Native Americans to a glorious victory over the vicious assault of U.S. General George Custer and his army. When it started, Custer led a force of 600 troops into the Little Bighorn Valley. The news of the upcoming assault soon spread among the Native Americans. Sitting Bull, the elder, gathered the warriors and ensured the survival of the women and children, while Crazy Horse led a massive force against the attackers. The Dawes Act of 1887 regulated land rights on tribal territories within the United States. The U.S. government passed a law that declared that each of the Native American family would receive 160 acres of tribal land, while each person would receive 80 acres. Last, the ghost dance was a mystic practice that began with the Indians of the Western America. It started with a series of visions from an elder Watsawab among the Paiute in around 1869. These visions foresaw a renewal of the earth and help for the Paiute people as promised by their ancestors.
Starting with the U.S. taking away land from the Native Americans and aiming to destroy their culture, a group of 90 Native Americans gathered for a 19th-month trip to occupy Alcatraz Island with the goal to reclaim the land that was once theirs. This protest shined light on the wrongs and broken treaties the natives have been dealing with from the government for decades, and they ended up reclaiming the island for a reservation. The Trail of Broken Treaties was a cross-country protest with goals of seeking justice for the amount of agreements that the government has broken. The group was described as an inspiration and had a stretch of people that was 4 miles long. The protest started a movement and built up a ton of traction for the Native Americans. They ended up proposing a 20-point position paper that fixed most broken treaties and sovereignty within the population. The American Indian Movement was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis and eventually grew to be a national movement. Most of the progress with civil rights or Native Americans are due to the American Indian Movement. They were the group behind the Trail of Broken Treaties, and needless to say, there could not have been much change without the group's existence.
Native American continued issues. Native American alcoholism. Alcohol is the most common drug used among Native Americans, although alcohol use is in lower numbers than other races such as Caucasians, Hispanics, and African Americans. Although this is true, the major issue that separates Native Americans from the rest is the high percentage of binge drinking started from a young age. Findings from the 2018 National Survey on Drug Use and Health include nearly a quarter of Native Americans report binge drinking in the past month. The rate of Native Americans with an alcohol use disorder, 7.1%, is higher than that of the total population, 5.4%. Native American alcohol use stems from the late 17th century, when the Europeans used alcohol as an instrument of trading. Alcohol began to become a bargaining chip for Europeans and Native Americans. Native forms of alcohol were weak compared to these new European spirits, and Native Americans became hooked. Back then, there was no practice of abstinence in tribal groups, but officials and colonial authorities began to attempt a ban on trade of liquor, which was largely ineffective. Drinking became a culture in Native American life and has been an issue ever since. Native American poverty. Native Americans have had the highest poverty rate among all minority groups, according to the 2018 U.S. Census. Their poverty rate was at 25.4%, while African Americans, the second highest, had a rate of about 20.8%. Native Americans also have the highest unemployment among minority groups with a rate of 6.6%. Poverty has been a long-lasting issue ever since the U.S. government shoved Native Americans onto reservations and they got to see the world change around them while keeping their own traditions and customs. The struggle of Native Americans to adjust to the new world led them to not be able to find a source of income and a good education. Social discrimination. Native Americans have been experiencing racism against themselves ever since they came in contact with the Europeans long ago. Ever since the country was colonized by foreigners, Native Americans were forced to assimilate and change their customs and traditions. Many converted to Christianity, but most attempted to maintain their traditional religious practices. Since the time of the U.S. government throwing Native Americans onto government-owned reservations, Native Americans have been separated from the world around them. Many of those Native Americans experienced discrimination for their differences from the modern world today. A video surfaced on January 19th of 2019 of a Native American man playing a song with his drums and singing in front of a group of young Trump supporters who were around our age. One kid in the front continues to stare down the man playing drums while the group of kids in the back yell and mock the Native American man, showing that this discrimination is still present today.